When Hugo Chavez died in March 2013, the entire world looked at his successor and laughed. Nicolás Maduro was a former bus driver. He was a civilian with a thick mustache and no military experience. In Venezuela, the presidency had almost always been a prize for soldiers. The army was the true power behind the throne. Chavez himself was a lieutenant colonel who had led a coup before he won an election. He commanded the respect of the barracks because he was one of them. He spoke their language. He had worn the uniform. Maduro was different. He was seen as weak. He was seen as a temporary puppet. The intelligence agencies in Washington and the political pundits in Caracas all predicted the same thing. They said that within 6 months, the military would step in. They said a general would walk into the Miraflores Palace, put a gun on the desk, and tell the bus driver to go home. It was the historical law of Latin America. Weak civilians get eaten by strong generals. But the coup never came. 6 months passed, then 6 years, then a decade. Nicolas Maduro is still in power, and the generals who were supposed to overthrow him are standing right behind him, saluting. How did he do it? How did a man with no military training tame a beast that has devoured so many presidents before him? The answer is that Maduro did not try to command the military. He decided to buy it. He realized very early on that he could not demand loyalty based on ideology or respect. He had to purchase it. And the currency he used was the Venezuelan state itself. He didn't just turn a blind eye to corruption. He made corruption the official operating system of the government. He transformed the Venezuelan armed forces from a military institution into a corporate holding company with a license to loot. To understand this transformation, we have to go back to the days immediately following Chavez's death. The military high command was restless. They looked at Maduro and saw a man who would likely lose the next election. They saw a man who might negotiate with the opposition. They were worried about their future. There were rumors of plots in the mess halls. Maduro made a move that was both brilliant and terrifying. He called a meeting with the top brass, but instead of threatening them with court-martials, he offered them a partnership. He effectively told them that if they kept him in power, he would give them the keys to the economy. He would let them run the country, not as public servants, but as CEOs of their own private fiefdoms. This was the birth of what the U.S. Department of Justice calls the Cartel of the Suns. The name comes from the insignia on the uniforms of Venezuelan generals. Instead of stars, they wear suns on their epaulets. A general of division wears 2 suns. A general-in-chief wears 4 suns. In the underworld of Venezuela, the more suns you have, the more product you can move. The first industry Maduro handed over was the drug trade. Venezuela shares a long, porous border with Colombia, the world's largest producer of cocaine. For years, drugs had trickled across this border, but under Maduro, the trickle became a flood. He allowed the military to take control of the border checkpoints, the airports and the ports. He gave them the authority to decide which trucks got searched and which planes took off without a flight plan. It was a franchise model of organized crime. If you were a general in charge of a border state like Apure or Zulia, you were essentially the regional manager of the cartel. You charged a tax on every kilo of cocaine that crossed your territory. If you were a general in the Air Force, you controlled the air bridge, sending drug-laden planes to Honduras and Mexico. If you were a general in the National Guard, you controlled the ports where drugs were hidden in shipping containers. This system solved 2 problems for Maduro. First, it made the generals incredibly rich. We are not talking about a few extra $1,000. We are talking about millions. Generals started buying estates in Spain and condos in Miami. They drove Ferraris in a country where the people were starving. Second, and more importantly, it made the generals unfireable. By allowing them to participate in international drug trafficking, Maduro turned them into criminals. He trapped them. A general who is just a soldier can defect to the United States and retire. A general who is a drug lord cannot defect because the DEA is waiting for him with a pair of handcuffs. Maduro bound their fate to his. If Maduro falls, they all go to federal prison in the United States. It was a loyalty scheme built on mutually assured destruction. The symbol of this new order was Diosdado Cabello. Cabello was a former military man and Maduro's main rival for power. He had deep connections in the barracks. Many thought he would be the one to stage the coup. But instead of fighting him, Maduro cut him in. Cabello is often described by U.S. investigators as the head of the Cartel of the Suns. He allegedly coordinates the major shipments and manages the relationships with the Colombian guerrillas. By letting Cabello run the illicit side of the business, Maduro neutralized his biggest political threat. But drugs were just the beginning. The drug trade is risky and illegal. Maduro wanted to give the military something safer and more legitimate to exploit. He looked at the vast resources of the Venezuelan state and started carving them up like a Thanksgiving turkey. He started with the oil. PDVSA. The state oil company was the jewel of Venezuela. It brought in 95% of the country's export revenue. Historically, it was run by technocrats and engineers. Maduro fired them and replaced them with military officers. He appointed a National Guard General Manuel Quevedo to run the company. Quevedo had no experience in oil. His only qualification was loyalty. When the military took over PDVSA, the goal was not to produce more oil. The goal was to siphon off the cash. They set up shell companies to handle procurement. They signed contracts for oil rigs that never arrived. They sold oil on the black market. The production of Venezuelan oil collapsed from 3 million barrels a day to less than 500,000. The infrastructure rusted away, but the bank accounts of the military officers running the company overflowed. They were cannibalizing the engine of the economy to feed the army that was supposed to protect it. Then there was the mining. In the south of Venezuela lies the Orinoco mining arc. It is an area larger than Portugal filled with gold diamonds and coltan. Maduro declared it a strategic development zone and handed control of it to the army. He effectively privatized a chunk of the Amazon rainforest and gave it to the generals. The generals didn't mine the gold themselves. They invited illegal armed groups, the guerrillas from Colombia, and criminal gangs to do the digging. These groups destroyed the environment, poisoned the rivers with mercury, and enslaved the indigenous population. The generals simply sat at the checkpoints and collected the gold. It was a feudal system. The gangs did the dirty work and paid tribute to the men with the suns on their shoulders. This created a bizarre spectacle in the Venezuelan economy. While the official currency, the bolivar, was collapsing into hyperinflation, the military economy was booming with hard currency. The generals were paid in dollars from oil gold from the mines and cash from the drugs. They were insulated from the misery of the population. They lived in a bubble of luxury that Maduro had built for them. This loyalty for profit scheme fundamentally changed the nature of the Venezuelan state. In a normal dictatorship, the military supports the government because they believe in the leader or the ideology. In Venezuela, the military supports the government because they own the government. They are shareholders in the enterprise of the state. To overthrow Maduro would be to fire their own CEO and bankrupt their own business. It also explains why the sanctions from the United States failed to split the military. The US government sanctioned dozens of generals, freezing their assets and revoking their visas. They thought that by squeezing the generals, they would force them to turn on Maduro. But the sanctions had the opposite effect. They proved to the generals that there was no life for them after Maduro. The sanctions confirmed that they were outlaws. It pushed them closer to the only man who could protect them. Maduro's genius, if you can call it that, was to understand the dark side of human nature. He knew that honor is fragile, but greed is durable. He knew that a general worried about his pension might rebel, but a general making $10 million a month from a gold mine will fight to the death to keep the status quo. But there was one final industry that Maduro had to hand over, the most cynical and cruel industry of all, the business of hunger. By 2016, Venezuela was starving. There was no food in the supermarkets. People were eating out of garbage trucks. The popularity of the government was at zero. Riots were breaking out daily. Maduro needed someone to control the food supply. He needed someone to decide who ate and who didn't. And he needed someone who would profit from the starvation so they wouldn't try to fix it. Once again, he turned to the men in green uniforms. He created a new program with a grand name, and he put the Minister of Defense in charge of every grain of rice entering the country. As we end the first part of this script, we see the structure of the deal. The drug trade, the oil, and the gold had all been signed over to the barracks. The generals were rich, and the bus driver was safe, but the country was hollowed out, the institutions were rotting, and the people were hungry. In the second part of this story, we will look at the Great Mission for Sovereign Supply. We will see how the military turned food imports into a billion-dollar scam. We will see how they weaponized hunger to control the population. And we will see the final tragic result of this deal, a military that has forgotten how to fight wars because it is too busy counting money. By the year 2016, Venezuela had ceased to function as a normal country. It had become a humanitarian disaster zone. The shelves of the supermarkets were bare, the lines to buy a loaf of bread stretched for city blocks. Mothers were skipping meals so their children could eat once a day. The national weight of the population was dropping. They called it the Maduro diet. But while the people were starving, the generals were about to discover their most profitable business yet. In July 2016, Nicolás Maduro appeared on television to announce a new decree. He called it the Great Mission for Sovereign Supply. It sounded like a humanitarian relief effort. He claimed he was going to solve the food crisis by streamlining distribution. But the devil was in the details. The decree handed total control of the nation's food supply to the Ministry of Defense. At the head of this mission, Maduro placed General Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the Minister of Defense. Padrino Lopez was a man who had cultivated an image of a constitutional soldier, a scholar of military history. But with this decree, he became the CEO of Hunger Inc. Maduro gave him power over all the ports, all the food processing plants, and all the distribution networks. Not a single ship carrying corn or wheat could dock in Venezuela without the military's permission. This created a massive opportunity for corruption. Venezuela imports almost all of its food. The government had a monopoly on the dollars needed to import goods. They would give dollars to trusted cronies at a subsidized exchange rate. For example, the government would sell a general $1 for 10 bolivars. The general would use that dollar to buy food abroad. But instead of buying high-quality food, he would buy the cheapest, lowest-quality pasta or rice he could find, often from companies owned by his friends in Mexico or Turkey. He would then bring that food back to Venezuela and sell it to the government at a massive markup. Or worse, he would sell the food on the black market for thousands of bolivars, making a profit margin of 10,000%. This scam was known as the food racket. The military officers in charge of the ports demanded bribes to let the food trucks pass. They skimmed off the top of every shipment. But the centerpiece of the system was the clap box. CLAP stands for Local Committees for Supply and Production. It was a box of subsidized food containing rice, pasta oil, and powdered milk that the government delivered directly to people's houses. For millions of Venezuelans, the clap box was the only thing standing between them and starvation. Maduro handed the distribution of these boxes to the military and the paramilitary gangs known as colectivos. This turned food into a weapon of social control. If you protested against the government, your box didn't arrive. If you didn't vote for the Socialist Party, your box didn't arrive. The military controlled the logistics of survival. They were not just profiting from the import scams, they were holding the population hostage. Investigations by journalists revealed that the milk powder in the clap boxes was essentially chalk. It had almost no nutritional value. It was imported from phantom companies in Mexico that were linked to Colombian businessmen close to Maduro. The generals knew the food was garbage. They knew the children drinking that milk were malnourished. But the contracts were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The generals signed the invoices and the money flowed into offshore accounts in Panama and Hong Kong. This corruption rotted the military from the inside out. A professional soldier spends his day training, maintaining equipment, and studying strategy. A Venezuelan soldier spent his day guarding food trucks, shaking down shopkeepers, and managing black market warehouses. Discipline collapsed. The chain of command became a chain of racketeering. Junior officers saw their generals getting rich, and they wanted a piece of the action. They set up their own checkpoints on the highways. If a farmer was trying to bring his cheese or vegetables to the city, the soldiers would stop him and demand half his cargo as a tax. It became impossible to do business in Venezuela without paying off the men in green. The military became a parasitic organism feeding on the dying body of the economy. This explains the mystery that puzzled so many foreign observers. Why did the Venezuelan military perform so poorly when tensions rose with neighboring countries? When the Venezuelan army tried to fight a small group of dissidents on the Colombian border in Apure in 2021, they were humiliated. They lost soldiers. They were ambushed. They looked incompetent. The reason was simple. They had forgotten how to be soldiers. They were businessmen in camouflage. You cannot run a cartel and an army at the same time. The maintenance of tanks and fighter jets was ignored because there was no profit in it. The radar systems broke down. The soldiers were demoralized, but the generals didn't care because the gold and the food money kept coming. Maduro's grip on power was secured not by the strength of his army, but by the depth of its corruption. He had created a trap that the generals could not escape. If a general decided to have a conscience and overthrow Maduro, he faced a terrifying problem. Who would support him? The United States? The U.S. Department of Justice had indictments against almost the entire high command. The Venezuelan people? The people hated the military because they saw them as the ones stealing their food and repressing their protests. The generals were isolated on an island of power surrounded by enemies. Their only friend was the bus driver who signed the checks. This is why when the opposition leader Juan Guaido tried to launch a military uprising in April 2019, it failed miserably. Guaido and the U.S. government offered amnesty to the generals. They promised to wipe the slate clean if they switched sides. But the generals did the math. They looked at the amnesty offer and they looked at their business empires. They realized that in a democratic Venezuela, there would be no clap boxes to steal from. There would be no illegal gold mines. There would be no drug flights. Democracy would mean a pay cut of 90%. So they ignored the amnesty. They put on their uniforms, appeared on television, and pledged their absolute loyalty to Nicolas Maduro. They weren't defending the Constitution, they were defending their revenue streams. This loyalty for profit scheme has had a devastating effect on the future of Venezuela. It has created a Praetorian Guard that will fight to the bitter end to prevent any change. It has militarized every aspect of society. The generals run the oil industry, the mining industry, the food industry, the water companies, and the electricity grid, and they have run all of them into the ground. The electricity grid collapses regularly, leaving the country in darkness for days. The water pumps fail. The oil refineries catch fire. This is the result of putting drug traffickers in charge of complex engineering systems. But for Maduro, incompetence is a price he is willing to pay. He doesn't need the electricity to work perfectly, he just needs the general in charge of the electricity to stay loyal. The Cartel of the Suns is now more than just a drug trafficking organization. It is the government itself. The line between the state and organized crime has been completely erased. Venezuela has become a mafia state where the army is the enforcer and the president is the don. Maduro took a gamble that no one thought would pay off. He bet that he could corrupt an entire institution faster than it could overthrow him. He was right. He understood that every man has a price, and if you control the printing press and the oil wells, you can pay any price. The briefcase moment we visualized, the general opening the case of gold, happens every day in Caracas. It happens when a contract is signed for food that will never arrive. It happens when a tanker of oil disappears from the radar. It happens when a gold bar is loaded onto a private plane. The general salutes, not because he respects the president, but because the president is the one holding the briefcase. As we look at Venezuela today, we see a country held hostage by this deal. The people are trapped between a government that starves them and an army that profits from their hunger. The bus driver tamer of general sits in his palace, secure in the knowledge that he has bought the most expensive insurance policy in the world. He turned the watchdogs into wolves and fed the country to them. The tragedy is that the Venezuelan military once had a proud history. It was the army of Simon Bolivar, the army that liberated 5 nations from Spanish rule. It was an army of heroes. Today it is an army of smugglers, wardens, and thieves. Nicolás Maduro didn't just destroy the economy of Venezuela, he destroyed the soul of its institutions. He proved that you can indeed tame a tiger if you feed it enough meat. But the tiger is no longer a wild beast. It is a fat, distinctively dangerous pet that will eat anyone who tries to take away its meal. This is Tom, and this is Inside the Global Economy. Subscribe now, because when this era is studied, only a few will be able to say they saw it coming.